She won most talkative in high school, and she has been running her mouth ever since. Welcome to the Lisa Fisher Said podcast with your host, Lisa Fisher.
Okay.
I know I'm not the only one who loves a good cult story and documentary, and if you've seen one, Rick Allen Ross was probably the guy they interviewed. He's the foremost authority on cults, and I've heard your story, but my listeners need to hear, what got you so interested? Like, you were way before there was a social media where you could share these things, but you were investigating cults before it was cool. What got you interested?
Well, Lisa, it was a personal situation. My grandmother was in a nursing home. The professional staff was covertly infiltrated by a group that planted its members there intentionally to target the elderly. And my grandmother was harassed. This took place around 1982. And I found out about it. I realized that a nurse's aide was harassing her. I found the backstory, talked to the director of the nursing home, and ultimately 5 people were let go who were associated with this fringe religious group. And that led to kind of a certain amount of news reporting in the community. This was in Phoenix. And subsequently, I was appointed on numerous committees, first in Phoenix and then nationally. And then I worked for a social service agency, specifically dealing with radical religious groups and cults.
Now, in 1982, what were you doing for a living? Were you a news reporter, or were you a lawyer? Like, what would give you such a deep dive into investigation into something that you weren't connected with?
Well, I was in a totally different kind of thing. My cousin owned a very large wrecking yard in Arizona, in Phoenix, and I was involved in the wrecking yard business.
Okay.
And we would scrap cars, crush metal, and rebuild some automobiles, and then warehouse parts. And I was very involved in that business, and I had no interest in anything that had to do with cults. I think if it hadn't have been for the fact that my grandmother was targeted, I probably never would have become involved. So it was very serendipitous how it all happened, and then it just kind of rolled along, and I was doing interventions. I would eventually do over 500 in the United States and internationally.
Wow.
And then around 1990, 91, an attorney contacted me and said, I'd like you to be an expert witness in a court proceeding. And that was the beginning of my work as an expert witness in court. I've now been qualified in 11 states, including United States federal court.
Wow.
And then as it rolled on, it just kept getting bigger. And there was this obscure group that I dealt with in the 80s that no one had ever heard of, which was the Waco Davidians.
Wow.
And when all hell broke loose in Texas in that cult standoff that ultimately many people died, I was the only cult expert who had actually dealt with the Davidians. And in fact, I had deprogrammed 3 Davidians. And so first the BATF and then the FBI consulted me. And then, of course, much later, bringing you current, I dealt with NXIVM. I was the first cult expert to deal with NXIVM and the first person to put critical information about the cult leader Keith Raniere online. And in my book, Cults Inside Out, it's the first book to even mention NXIVM about cults. And Keith Raniere and I, we really went through quite a tangle together because he sued me for 14 years. And the lawsuit was dismissed out of federal court shortly before his arrest. But he spent $5 million suing me, Lisa, for
Are you kidding me?
Over a decade.
For defamation of character, libel, slander?
Defamation, product disparagement, copyright violation, trade secret
violation.
Trade secret violation. Well, his premise was that I published articles by a psychiatrist and a clinical psychologist that had reviewed the curriculum that he was teaching through NXIVM, which was a seminar selling self-help, self-improvement course curriculum. And you'd go through these intensives for like a week, 2 weeks, and pay outrageous amounts of money. And so the doctors reviewed the notes and the curriculum, and then they critiqued it. And in their analysis, they would quote from the literature, from the notes. And so Raniere came up with this crazy idea. Well, that's my trade secret, and those words are under copyright. Oh. And so he pursued it for 14 years.
Well, we know he's a fool. Is he serving time now, finally?
Oh, yeah. He is serving over 120
That's
years.
That's what I thought. I was thinking he was that one, yeah.
Yeah, so he's like 60, and let's assume that he makes it to parole. He'll be well over 100 years old. So I think it's safe to say Keith Raniere is going to die in prison.
Good,
and then there were others that were imprisoned along with him. Claire Bronfman, the Seagram's heiress, she's doing over 6 years. Nancy Salzman, who is just a terrible person that I had to deal with over the years. Very destructive, very malicious. She is doing only 3.5 years because she was the first one to flip and do a deal. I don't know if you remember, but when they raided her house, they found $500,000 in cash stashed in her house.
Yeah.
She was quite a character.
Well, let me ask you something. So, with your grandma, what was the name of that cult? Do you ever go forward with that?
It was called the Jewish Voice Broadcast. And my family is Jewish. I'm Jewish. My grandmother was in a Jewish nursing home. And that group saw itself as a kind of fundamentalist Pentecostal outreach targeting Jews specifically.
So, for money. They're trying to get grandma's money.
Well, I don't think so, because my grandmother did not have any money. But I think that they did get money from a number of elderly people, and perhaps they thought they might get some from her. But their ministry was more based on constant fundraising online. At the time, it would have been a cable network, TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, that carried their show. And in those days, a guy by the name of Lewis Kaplan, who was a former Jew who had become...
My maiden name. Yes, Kaplan was my birth name. So, I'm tracking with you.
Well, he became a Pentecostal minister. But his background was Jewish. And so he was, if you will, kind of a Jew for Jesus kind of thing, not affiliated with that organization, which was launched by a guy by the name of Martin Rosen, who's now deceased. But anyway, it was a group, Lisa, that in my mind maliciously targeted Jews specifically for proselytizing. And so, I had no objection to them sharing their faith, but the idea that they covertly planted their people on the staff of a Jewish nursing home, that just violated every ethical principle I could think of.
I understand, but no crimes were committed.
No crimes were committed, though the people that were on the staff were fired. And that led to kind of pulling together a consensus in the interfaith community in Phoenix. What is or is not ethical in missionary work? Number one, don't target people in nursing homes that don't invite you. Go through the front door. Say, we're doing a Bible study. Is anybody interested? And then people can sign up. Do not try to recruit minors without parental notification or consent. Do not target incarcerated prisoners who are not interested. Don't go and preach to a captive audience, literally. And don't go cruising hospitals and rehabilitation centers trying to find people that are ill, that are going through a difficult time, and target them without them requesting you to come in and their families being aware of that. So we found we found that there was a consensus on that.
Yeah. It's protecting the vulnerable, which if we don't do something in this country right now, we've got to protect children. We've got to. And we've got to protect vulnerable people. So I totally respect that. But I just didn't know, because then as you did a deeper dive into the cults that exist today, crimes are usually involved.
Frequently. People will often say to me, though, I probably get a call every day or an email saying, isn't it illegal for people to be brainwashed? Isn't it illegal for coercive persuasion techniques to be used to break people down and gain undue influence over them? And the answer is not in the U.S. It's becoming a crime in Europe and the U.K., but not in the U.S. So until they get involved in financial fraud, extortion, physical abuse, medical neglect, abuse of minor children, different things like that, where they cross the line, simply gaining undue influence over people and then exploiting them within the parameters of the law, is you can get away with it. And there are many cult leaders who are very rich and who have taken advantage of people, and they have enriched themselves and become quite wealthy from being cult leaders.
So just mentioning NXIVM, and I'm the others that I'm thinking of, the FLDS. We have Tony Alamo here in Arkansas. Sex is one draw, and money is the other draw. Are those the two tenets that identify something as a cult?
Well, there are three core characteristics, Lisa. Number one, there is a charismatic leader who has no meaningful accountability, a totalitarian dictator who becomes an object of worship, like Tony Alamo did. Number two, there would be an identifiable process of coercive persuasion being used to break people down, change them, subordinate them, or basically compromise their ability to critically think to gain undue influence.
That's the brainwashing part.
Yes. And then the third element would be, is the group destructive? Does the group exploit people, do harm to people? And that varies by degree from group to group. Some groups are much worse than others. The Alamo group was an extreme group. I mean, Tony Alamo basically was kind of the boyfriend of and husband later of the founder of the ministry, which was Susan, his wife.
That's
and when she died, they for a long time thought that she would resurrect, and they were praying and so on.
Crazy.
But Tony Alamo took over, and it became a multi-million-dollar financial empire based out of Arkansas, but across the United States. And Alamo abused members of the group sexually. He took advantage of young women, children, and he exploited them for his own sexual benefit. And eventually, of course, he ended up being convicted criminally and going to prison. But for many years, the Alamo group made these very elaborate, they would take a Levi jacket and they would have all their members embroider sequins and gemstones and everything, and they would make these incredibly beautiful hand-embroidered jackets, which they would sell for an outrageous amount of money in Hollywood, mostly in California, and celebrities would buy them not knowing that there were members of the group with their fingers bleeding from doing this work who knows how many hours a day. So that's one example of how Alamo exploited the members of the group to make money. And so you have groups that have an absolute authoritarian leader, use coercive persuasion to gain undue influence, and then to some degree harm and exploit the members. Those are the three core characteristics of a destructive cult.
And, the thing about Tony Alamo, he was a Jew at birth and became a Christian. And Susan, they had different names. They thought they were going to be discovered in Hollywood. I've done a deep dive because I am in Arkansas and I've been a news reporter all these years. So we've covered the story. And as you know, like with a lot of criminals, they have to get them on something like U.S. mail fraud. It's so hard to peg these people because, as you know, the victims then don't come forward. They're embarrassed. They're still in it. They still think it's so hard to reverse brainwashing. So when I did some research on it and I saw that families, like when he would approach a family, it's like in the FLDS when Warren Jeffs would come in, he would part the Red Sea, people would come over and he would say, "And I pick you, my child," and the child's 9, and the family willingly agrees they're culpable. That's whose head needs to be on a platter, these parents who would agree to allow their children to be violated in ways that I can't even talk. I mean, it's so difficult to even wrap your mind around as a parent.
Well, Lisa, the FLDS is a kind of unique kind of thing. Let's keep in mind that this is a group that goes back about 100 years.
Yeah.
And they are a splinter from the mainstream Mormon LDS Church, because in 1890, the president of the church, Woodruff, declared polygamy no more. He said no more polygamy. So all these groups began...
Because they started on polygamy, right? I mean, Joseph Smith's vision was about polygamy, right?
Well, Joseph Smith had over 40 wives. Brigham Young had over 50 wives. But in 1890, in order to become a state, Utah, the church did a complete course correction. And they said no more polygamy. And there were people that wanted to continue this lifestyle. They believed that it was mandated by the founder of the church and the second most important person in the church, Brigham Young, in its history. So they felt this is what we are supposed to do. And the FLDS created their communities relatively in isolation in Colorado City, Arizona, and Hilldale, Utah. And for many decades, they lived there in isolation, controlling the town, controlling the police force, controlling the schools, controlling public works, and creating an empire that under Warren Jeffs' father, Rulon Jeffs, was valued at somewhere between $150 and $200 million. So, and included 10,000 people that were multi-generational. So when you talk about the parents, Lisa, you have to understand they knew no other life. This was their life. This was what they grew up in. They were born into it. Their father, their mother was born into it. Their grandparents were born into it. So the unfortunate thing is that Rulon Jeffs was a very authoritarian and he could be quite harsh leader. But his son, Warren Jeffs, crazy, psychopath. So once he took over the reins of power, he took things to a level that had never been imagined. I mean, he was having sex with 10-year-olds. And he created this Yearning for Zion Ranch near El Dorado, Texas, that was this elaborate compound with a temple. I mean, he spent millions of dollars building it. And then he brought all these families there with children and everything, and he created his own world. And what we see in cults is social isolation. And by doing that, the leader is able to filter out reality, and instead create a false reality, a pseudo-reality, in a kind of bubble world controlled by the cult leader. And so you have all these kids, all these families thinking, this is where God wants us. If I leave, I will be damned. And in the polygamist FLDS, they tell them, if you leave the organization, you will lose your salvation. And when you die, you will be suspended in eternal darkness forever. And so there's all this fear. And
that's abusive right there.
Yeah. And so the parents feel they have no choice. The children feel they're doing what God has mandated. And it's a crazy kind of upside down world where what we think is crazy, they think is normal, and what we think of as normal, they think is absurd.
Crazy.
Yeah. Right. So, that's the story of the FLDS. Thank God they went in, they raided the place, they found information in the Yearning for Zion Ranch, and now Warren Jeffs is in prison in Texas, still running the group from prison.
Right, he's still calling the shots. That's when I think, so do those people not have internet access to read about Warren Jeffs to see that he is a psychopath?
Well, Lisa, what's happening to FLDS is, I call it a death by 1,000 cuts. So what's happening is, yes, people are accessing information online. The group is disintegrating. There are less and less members, more and more former members. Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona are now completely different than they were when he was reigning supreme outside of prison. And also all the money's being cut. All of their side hustles, their businesses that were fueled by the group's low labor costs or free labor costs, that's all being dried up. So I think the FLDS is on its way out. And then there's another big polygamist group called the Kingston Clan that also is in Utah. They also accumulated assets in excess of $100 million. And that group is slowly, being cut here, cut there by law enforcement, and eventually I think it might bleed out.
Now, FLDS typically, now I can't make a blanket statement, these groups are anti-Semitic. I would assume FLDS is, because they're the only way, according to them. Why would they use the term Zionist? Because that's a very Jewish term.
Well, look, they're not specifically anti-Semitic, but you're right, Lisa. They're certainly exclusive, ethnocentric group that says, hey, we are the only group that has the truth. The mainstream Mormon church is wrong. Other polygamist groups are wrong. Only our leader is the true prophet. And either you submit to our authority or you're lost. So they see themselves as a restoration of the priesthood of Aaron, and they see themselves as the new chosen people. There's been a lot of reporting lately about a movement called the Black Hebrews or the Black Israelites. There was a basketball player that was putting links online to these groups and their videos, many of which are shared through YouTube, by the way. Those groups see themselves as the chosen people. They are the true Israel. African Americans, they say, are the chosen people of God. And they are very anti-Semitic and very specifically focus anti-Semitic messages about Jews, because they say the Jews are not really Israel, they are liars. And in fact, we are the chosen people. We have supplanted them, replaced them. They are no longer genuine. So there are groups that are cults that are very anti-Semitic. But typically what a cult will say is, look, it's our way or you're lost. There is no other way. There is no other future than through us. And so they create a kind of we-they world where if you are not part of the group, you feel compromised. You feel like you have turned away from God. You've turned away from the truth. You have no pathway to success. And the group makes you dependent. They engender dependency upon the group and the leader to feel fulfilled, to feel your life has purpose, meaning, and hope.
What's interesting, I think FLDS, maybe LDS, maybe Jehovah's Witnesses, they all use the 144,000 terminology from the Bible. And so they're saying of all the aggregate Mormons or LDS or whatever their religion is, only 144,000 of us are getting to go to build the New Jerusalem, or they'll be in the Promised Land, or whatever their term. I forget what they're talking when they talk about heaven. Is that a common characteristic among some of these groups?
Well, you're talking about those groups that are based on the Bible. Because many of the groups in the U.S. are based on the Bible, because it has credibility, it has authority, it's more saleable than having a message based on outer space aliens or something else. So what they will do is they will hook on to different verses which they will manipulate to reinforce their authority and control people. And the 144,000, which is mentioned in the Bible, I think in Revelations, is one of the keys. Now, the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Russell, he was at the time that he was leading the group. They had less than 144,000. So he probably thought that was a pretty good hook for recruitment.
Oh, I see.
And that he could keep recruiting. But then, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses far surpassed that number. And now they have what is known as the anointed class, which are those people that will be part of the 144,000 and others will not. And I think with Jehovah's Witnesses, what you can see, Lisa, is a group that began, in my opinion, as a destructive cult under one man. They were known actually as the Russellites. And then a man by the name of Rutherford succeeded Russell. And then it continued to be a personality cult dictated over by one man. But after the death of Rutherford, power devolved. And now the Jehovah's Witnesses have what is called the governing body, which is about a dozen or so white men, old men, who run the organization. And they choose who will replace who and who will come in to this governing group, which lives very well under the auspices of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Imagine that.
and they exercise complete power. But I would say that now the Witnesses are not a destructive cult, in my opinion, but they are, in my opinion, a destructive authoritarian organization. Because I would make the distinction that when they were ruled over by one individual, they fit the criteria of a destructive cult. But when they devolved power to a governing body, it was a step in another direction, albeit they are still, in my opinion, very destructive.
Wouldn't you also include then in your definition that if you choose to leave that organization and you are then permanently estranged, you are shunned by your family, wouldn't that be another tenet to what a cult is? Because a lot of these we're talking about, you can't leave, or if you do, you never see your family again, which is obviously a big deterrent.
Well, I think that's one of the things you look for, Lisa. You look for a group that, you ask this question, is there any legitimate reason to leave? Or if I leave, am I judged to be a negative in some way? Am I ostracized? I mean, because that is not a typical church or a typical organization. People quit clubs, they switch political parties, they move from one church to another, and they are not condemned by their former group. But when you are in a group that makes you feel there is no legitimate reason to leave, then you might be in a cult or a cult-like authoritarian group. And Jehovah's Witnesses has a feature of their group called disfellowshipping, in which they will read out and designate that someone has been disfellowshipped, and then they may be shunned by their family, their friends, and ostracized. Also, the Mormon Church has excommunication, in which they would shun, not to the extent of Jehovah's Witnesses, but quite substantially, and perhaps the most withering group in regards to shunning people is Scientology. Scientology has what's called a disconnection policy. So if you were critical of Scientology, they might label you, as they have me, a suppressive person, an SP. And then they would say that if you hang out with an SP, you are a PTS, a potential trouble source. So that's not a good thing. So basically, they have this disconnection policy, and if you leave, your family disconnects from you, your friends in Scientology disconnect from you, and they have nothing whatsoever to do with you. And so many people are very reluctant to leave Scientology because they're afraid of how it's going to affect their life in regards to their family, their friends, and so forth.
In the first meeting where they rush you as a Scientologist, I guess they don't bring that part up.
No. And
Right.
what's weird about Scientology, Lisa, is you're paying for enlightenment. So
big money.
Yeah, big money, and you're moving up the levels. First you reach what they call clear, which could cost quite a bit of money. And then you start moving up these operating thetan levels, THETAN, thetan levels.
It rhymes with Satan levels.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, it does. But it's you go up the OT levels, OT1 through OT8. I think Tom Cruise is an OT8 now. John Travolta an OT7. Kirstie
So is
Alley.
David Miscavige then the OT8? Is he at the top?
He's beyond that. They call him the chairman of the board. I mean, he is an absolute dictator over Scientology.
Yeah.
And in that sense, Scientology, in my opinion, continues to be a destructive cult because L. Ron Hubbard died in 1986, and David Miscavige, who was his secretary and kind of gatekeeper, became in his 20s the virtual dictator of Scientology. And he froze out the Hubbard family, took over the entire empire. And when L. Ron Hubbard died, he left an estate that was declared around $600 million. But today, Scientology is worth somewhere between $3 and $4 billion.
Unbelievable.
And it's all tax exempt, pretty much. And they own property all over the world.
But they're not a religion.
Well, they are acknowledged and officially recognized as a religion by the United States Internal Revenue Service. So they have 501c3 nonprofit religious status, which means they don't have to pay property taxes on their properties that they hold in their portfolio. And I mean, it is very substantial real estate portfolio that they have. They own a chunk of L.A., Los Angeles, Hollywood.
Yeah.
They have
and Florida.
Clearwater. Yeah.
Yes, Clearwater, yes.
Yeah. So Scientology is just an incredibly wealthy organization, though it is losing members on a constant basis. They will say they have millions of members, but I think in actual real terms, committed people that are doing coursework, that are involved, it could be as few as 25,000 or perhaps as many as 50,000.
Then what do those people do? Because once you go live on the compound, what are you doing to make money? Because you still have to push money into the organization. I guess they have these companies then that are run by Scientologists that are out there working for a living and making money and putting the money in. Because it seems like they're so isolated, they're not out in the real world, except for the actors.
Well, Lisa, there are two categories of Scientologists to look at. One is called the SEA organization.
The Sea Org, yeah.
The Sea Org.
Yeah.
Now, the Sea Org has maybe 5,000 people.
Okay.
And they eat, sleep, breathe, live total Scientology, 24/7. They're living in Scientology housing. They're working at Scientology facilities across the United States and around the world. Then you have what are called the publics, which are people that are paying to be put through courses, auditing, which is spiritual counseling in Scientology. But they're living a regular life. Like John Travolta, he has his homes, he has his life. Though I would say that the celebrities, which represent the highest caste order of Scientology, they're cocooned quite a bit. And there are many people that are kind of buzzing around them that are Scientologists that are there to help them, serve them, make their life easier. And then, of course, Scientology has the celebrity centers where they hope that they can recruit celebrities or give celebrities special treatment that are in Scientology. One of the things that is very much in the news lately is the case of Danny Masterson. Danny Masterson was one of the stars of the That 70s show, and he is being accused of raping a number of women, and those women were in Scientology, and they claim that because they were in Scientology, Scientology tried to keep them quiet, tried to muzzle them, so that Danny Masterson, one of their celebrity members, would not have to be dragged into court, and Scientology would not have to be exposed in the way they are being exposed through the Masterson trial, which just recently ended in a declared mistrial. And
I hate that.
Scheduled new trial. But what the women are saying is that because they were in Scientology and because Masterson was a celebrity member, they were more or less handled by Scientology and told to shut up and not to go to the police, not to do anything. Now, Scientology denies that. They say that they would never tell a member not to report a crime perpetrated by another member. I find that hard to believe. And I've dealt with Scientology for many years, and I've dealt with some of their tactics and harassment and so forth. And I think that the stories that are told by these women that say they were raped by Danny Masterson are very believable.
Me too. I absolutely believe them. When John Travolta's wife, who finally passed away from breast cancer, Kelly Preston, was she denied medical care, or did she not pursue medical care because of their auditing, or is auditing only psychological?
Well, Lisa, a lot of times people misunderstand Scientology. Scientology does not prohibit medical care. You can go to your dentist, you can go to your oncologist, whomever. What they prohibit is treatment by mental health professionals.
Right.
No clinical psychologist, no marriage and family therapist, no psychiatrist, no psychiatric medication. This may have affected the life of Jet Travolta, John Travolta's son, who was autistic, and might have benefited from different types of care from mental health professionals. But as far as Kelly Preston, who died from cancer, she would have gotten, I would think, the best medical care possible.
Okay.
Because that is not in the sphere of mental health, her ailment. And that was a very unusual marriage. There have been claims again and again and again that John Travolta is gay and that he lives an alternate life secretly. But I think that Kelly Preston and John Travolta were very close. They must have been best friends. And he seemed to take her death very hard. And she was a hardcore Scientologist right to the end. And John Travolta has repeatedly claimed that Scientology has helped him get through the death of his son Jet, the death of his wife Kelly Preston. But I would argue that Scientology has, I think, hurt John Travolta at times. But and many people in Hollywood will say, well, you know, John Travolta's a great person. He's very nice. But I know of people that he was close to in Scientology that were in Sea Org, that when they reached out to him for help or they were in distress, he pretty much ignored them. So I think people like John Travolta and Tom Cruise always put Scientology first over, you know, the human needs of people. And you might recall that Paul Haggis, the film director and scriptwriter, responsible for the movie Crash, I think he has an Oscar for that. And anyway, when he left Scientology, he was very concerned about his family also coming out, because he recognized the potential for family estrangement. And he was fortunate that they all did, Same thing with Leah Remini. When she came out of Scientology, her family basically came out with her. And so she didn't have to go through that hardship or that suffering. But the man who works with Leah Remini on their television program and their podcast, Mike Rinder, I love him. He went through hell.
I know.
Absolute hell. He lost his family. He went through just incredible suffering.
Well, they'll chase you down, too. I mean, they harass you, which there's a crime. That's what I'm saying. These crimes are overlooked. The whole Shelley Miscavige thing, where's Shelley Miscavige? We still don't know. They say LAPD knows. They've turned a blind eye to it. Do you think she's alive?
Oh, yeah. She's in a facility in Northern California, probably very comfortable. But whether she recognizes it or not, she's there because David Miscavige didn't want her around. And so he put her in this relatively obscure facility.
Oh, he wrote her off.
He basically said, "Get thee to a nunnery." I mean, that would be the analogy I would use. You know, in the old days, if a king in the medieval Europe wanted to get rid of somebody, he'd send a woman. He'd send her to a nunnery where she'd be a cloistered nun. I think Shelley Miscavige is somewhat like that. She's isolated in a Scientology facility, cut off from a lot of people, like Leah.
What torture!
Like Leah Remini, who was trying to find her. But I think they've done wellness checks of Shelley Miscavige. That is, the police have come out and they say, "Are you okay? Are you ill? Do you want to leave?" And of course, she's a hardcore member. She's saying, "I want to stay. I want to be here. I'm fine." And she's probably being fairly well treated as the wife of the chairman of the board of Scientology. But in my opinion, the reason she's there is David Miscavige just wanted her out of the way. He did not want her around anymore, and he put her there.
Okay, there's one cult, and I've heard you in a lot of conversations, and I don't think I've heard you talk about this one, and this one is near and dear to me because they are neighbors in Tennessee, and I was a part of the Bible study with Gwen Shamblin when it was just the Way Down workshop. I did the Bible study, and then my friends in Nashville, I remember my friend emailing me and say, my friend knew Gwen, said she's totally off the rails. She says she's the only way to God. She doesn't believe in the Trinity. The things, because I'm Jewish by birth, became a Christian in college. So I love both faiths. But with that, we all wrote her off. Well, then that, as you know, is a very serious situation, and she obviously dies in a plane crash. So what are your feelings on the Remnant Church and Way Down Workshop?
Well, I dealt with Gwen Shamblin through families calling me for many, many years. And they would say, "Look, we have a family member in Remnant, and we don't communicate. We have no communication whatsoever." And so the same kind of cutting off and isolation went on with the Shamblin Church that I witnessed over the years. And of course, as you say, she said, "We're the only way. I'm the only person that can lead you. You need to subordinate yourself to me." And she became like a queen. If you look at the video when she married Joe Lara, who
I love that video. Anyone listening, you've got to Google it. It is insane.
It is insane. But now Joe Lara's former girlfriend, the mother of his daughter, actually retained me. And I would have been an expert witness in the custody battle between Joe Lara and his estranged girlfriend, Natasha. So Natasha was not able to get me in as an expert because the judge ruled incredibly in this case that no testimony regarding Remnant Fellowship or Gwen Shamblin would be relevant to the custody battle, even though it was absolutely relevant because Gwen Shamblin was controlling the little girl and controlling her food, controlling her diet. I mean, these people basically starve themselves, and they have to be thin. So Gwen Shamblin's husband, David, he got kind of fat. And so
they wrote him off. They Shelley Miscaviged him right out of there.
Well, but a lot of money changed hands. I mean, Gwen Shamblin gave him about $3 million in cash. He got a part of a real estate portfolio that was valued at $20 million. And what happened when Gwen Shamblin died? And many people believe Joe Lara, who was not a licensed pilot, was actually flying the jet and flew it into a lake, and they all died. What happened out of that was the realization that Gwen Shamblin was very rich, and that she was not going to give even a penny to the church to carry on after her. She gave all the money to her children. Now, many of the leaders died with Gwen Shamblin.
Yeah.
I would predict that this will be a disintegrating group, because most often what happens, Lisa, when a cult leader dies or is put in prison, think of the cult leader as like the hub of a wheel. And when the hub is missing, the wheel begins to collapse or begins to splinter apart. And that's what will probably happen with Remnant Fellowship, because Gwen Shamblin was the organizational glue that held everything together. It was her personality, their worship of her, if you will, that kept the group together. And Joe Lara, that is such a bizarre story, that she basically got rid of her longtime husband, David.
Of like 38 years or so. Yeah. And she was so against divorce.
Yeah.
And then he got fat, and then she, like I said, Shelley Miscaviged him to the nunnery, and then Superman. What was he? Superman? What was his? He was some actor.
He was Tarzan. He was
Tarzan.
Tarzan in New York. He was
yes.
He was one of these Tarzan adventure hero types. I don't know how long ago that was. When he married Shamblin, he was in his 50s, and he was for her a trophy husband. And she had that bizarre wedding where she was like a fairy queen dancing in her bizarre outfit with that
children
crazy hairdo.
All there. Oh my! The crazy hair.
Yeah. And it's interesting. They're going to do 2 movies about Shamblin. One will be done by Lifetime, and then Jennifer Grey will play Shamblin. And then,
have you seen the photo of that yet?
Yeah, it looks bizarre.
Last week they posted it, and a boy from Little Rock did the wig, because part of her story is the hair.
The hair. I mean,
the hair.
Yeah, it was the epitome of big hair. It was paralyzed and sprayed into place.
Paralyzed and sprayed,
and it looked like a wig, but it wasn't.
No, it was her hair.
It was her hair. And then, there's another series that is now going to be done by HBO as well. Because the Shamblin story is just such a bizarre story.
Totally.
Gwen Shamblin actually started out fairly credible. She was a dietitian, well-educated. She wrote a successful book, very successful book, in which she said, if we really pray to God and ask the Lord to help us with our diet, I think God will be helpful. And we can diet more effectively with faith as a component of the diet. And a lot of people embraced that, and she became a best-selling author, and she made, I'm sure, millions of dollars from her book and lectures. But then it changed and it evolved into a subculture. And then that subculture became a cult that worshipped Gwen Shamblin, in my opinion. And subsequently, she created this church, and I guess she had some exposure to the United Pentecostal Church International or Jehovah's Witnesses, who both insist that there is no such thing as the Trinity. And so she incorporated that into her own little church.
Yes, that was it.
Yeah, and that made her unique. And that's what cult leaders typically do. I see this over and over and over again. They collect different beliefs from different groups, typically copying them. Keith Raniere copied almost everything from Scientology, Landmark Education, Ayn Rand writings. But in the case of most of these religious groups, they will grab little doctrines from other groups, create a composite that is unique in its composition, in what pieces they put together, and then they will say, look, I'm the only one who's got it right. I mean, where else can you go that has this doctrine, this doctrine, this doctrine? And without those doctrines, you cannot be saved. And so from a Christian standpoint, it always is salvation by works. It is not salvation by grace, which is the typical message of Christianity, but rather, no, Jesus died on the cross, but it wasn't enough. You need us. You need Jesus. I call it Jesus plus theology, where Shamblin would say, Jesus died on the cross, great, but it wasn't enough. You need to be with me. You need to be in the Remnant Fellowship. You need to be really thin. You need to believe all the doctrines that I have put together in a unique way. And only then can you make it into heaven. And so these people are basically, in a way, psychological, emotional prisoners. And they're locked in there with the ministry. They feel that if they leave, they're going to hell. They're going to lose God. They're going to miss heaven. And so they stay for years and years and years. And they suffer a lot. A lot of these people in groups like Remnant Fellowship, they suffer. But they suffer because they think they have no alternative. And in that sense, it's an unseen kind of prison. You can't see the bars, but they're there. And that's constructed by the leader.
Yeah, that's insane. Also, with Gwen's church, if you gained weight, you were on the outs. And if your kids didn't obey, then you were responsible. If your kids weren't abiding in Christian principles. Now, Rick, one thing about you obviously born into Jewish faith. You sure know a lot about Christianity.
Well,
you have to have some belief then that Jesus had something to do with this, because you know it better than a lot of Christians I know.
Well, the reason why, Lisa, is because I end up working with people that are in Bible-based, supposedly Bible-based religious cults. And they twist the scriptures and they manipulate it. So I have spent literally decades untwisting scriptures and basically just working with a good study Bible. And what I will tell people is, look, I have this NIV study Bible, and every verse has a footnote. And what is that footnote? It is the consensus of biblical scholars over a period of centuries as to what this scripture means. And sometimes it'll say, we're not really sure, or we don't know, or most of the time they will define it. And I will say, why is it that your group is interpreting this scripture in a way that it has never been interpreted historically? And then the next question I ask that person is, does this interpretation empower the group, and does it put you in a position of vulnerability? Because if that is the case, then you can see that the self-interest of the leader is at play here, not the Bible. And so I will talk to people about the most basic message, I think, of Christianity, which is salvation is free. You can have it without even fellowshipping. You can have it without baptism. Even the Baptists would say, if you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, you have salvation, even if you didn't get to be baptized before you died.
That's right.
So what I say to people is, these people that you're involved with, from a Christian biblical perspective, they are setting themselves up as brokers. They are saying that they are God's exclusive brokers for salvation, and that you have to go through them, and they have to give you the nod, the approval. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what Jesus did. It doesn't matter what God did. It's Are you with them or are you not with them? And then I ask the question, who does that serve? Does that serve God, or does that serve this man-made organization on earth that is manipulating you? And it's, there are organizational structures with a hierarchy and so forth, but let's just say there are some that are relatively benign and are not hurting people, and there are others that are extremely destructive. So when a person says to me, gee, it's really hard being in this group, I have to make sacrifices, financial sacrifices. Maybe I'm not seeing a doctor because the group believes that medicine is wrong, or maybe I'm severely punishing my child with physical punishment because this is dictated by the group. And there are groups like this. And they're saying it's a really hard road that I'm on, but I'm on it because this is the way. This is the only way. And I'm saying to them, okay, you're acknowledging that you're paying this incredible cost to be in the group, and it's hurting you, it's hurting your family, or so you think. Is it really based on anything in the Bible? Is this about God, or is it about these people using the Bible to gain power, wealth, and exploit people? And most of the interventions I do end with the person saying, you know what, I'm going to take a break. I'm going to leave the group for a while, and I'm going to reflect. I'm going to study the Bible independently. I'm going to go to other people to study the Bible with because I think that that's in my best interest. And about 20, 25, 30% of the people that I meet with to do an intervention, they'll look at me at the end and say, I don't care. I'm going to continue with the group. This is the truth. This is what I want. I just did an intervention recently over a group called the World Mission Society Church of God that literally believes that a woman in South Korea is God. They call her Mother God, and they worship her. And I met with a young father. He has a son, a little daughter, loving wife, beautiful family. And he's very well educated with a degree in IT and works for a Fortune 500 company. And he got recruited by this group. I think at either Costco or Walmart. They recruit. Yeah, they recruit. They recruit in supermarkets and malls.
Oh my word!
He had no idea what he was getting involved in, and I worked with him. And he had been a member for less than a year. And I'd had success with other people that I worked with. But with him, at the end, he said, you know what? I'm choosing God over my family. And I looked at him and I said, you know what? You're not choosing God over your family. You're choosing this woman in South Korea who you don't even know, who doesn't even give a damn about you. You're choosing her over your family. And you're going to regret it. You're going to regret it because your family is going to be gone, you're going to be alone, and you're going to think, what happened? And I just want you to keep all the things that we've discussed in your head and realize you can leave, and that doesn't mean that you're turning your back on God or that you're in sin. It just means that you care about your family. And you can still love God and still be a Christian, but not with this group. And it didn't work. At the end, his family is now gone. His wife and children are gone, and he's, I guess, living alone in this house. And his wife has left. So
horrible.
But I think in his mind, Lisa, he thinks he made a choice between. He's
justified, right?
Yeah,
he did what's right.
And why does he think that? Because they indoctrinated him to think that.
Brainwashed him, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely a component. Well, this is the podcast where people will say they're going to save this one, they're going to keep it on their phone, and they're going to push this one out. Because this is the best way to approach someone that... there are parents right now listening that go, I have a child who's in XYZ. Or I have a parent or a sister. It's like the same thing with somebody who has someone who's in addiction. You do anything you can to help them, to throw them a lifesaver. And as you know, in addiction, a lot of times people go, yeah, I'll keep loving my bottle, my booze, my whatever they're doing. And it's the same thing with this. So all we can do is get the message out. We're doing it. All your book, Cults Inside Out, will be in the show notes. I'll put some links to other things that I've seen you on through the years. You're a great communicator. And, Christianity, we'd love to have you because you are almost one of us. Because the Jewish faith, we're the original anyway. So we'd love to have you. You've done a great job today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for listening to the Lisa Fisher Said podcast. Be sure to hit subscribe and download all the episodes and leave a review, won't you? The Lisa Fisher Said podcast is produced by ClantonCreative.com.